My first action is to introduce Peter Blaskos, who will share his thoughts for the day. So just on to Peter.
Yes, good evening. Just checking you're all hearing me. Yes, may we be grateful for our meeting together. We've had some snow, but who cares about weather? The flag for victory over COVID has been furled, with variants coming in from all over the world, making the case for caution that much stronger, and our isolation in lockdown will be much longer. So let's give thanks that we'll converse for an hour. We'll hear Ian Priest explain China's long road to power. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. As usual, very relevant. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Ian Priest. Ian and I are both members of a speaking club in Bishop Stortford area called the 12 Club, where we have both been members, I think, for 20 years, roughly now, Ian.
At least, yeah.
I've therefore been privileged to listen to many excellent talks from Ian. Ian's career prior to retiring was in the diplomatic service and therefore well experienced in international travel and affairs, and therefore we're very well qualified to talk tonight about China. Now, Ian, are you happy about sharing your screen? You've got slides to show.
Well, shall we do that now, just to get the thing up there? So there we are. That's my, no, what I need to do is to,
you've got to press the green square at the
I've
bottom.
got to press the green button, haven't I? There we go. Right, now there is the presentation. So
no, it's not coming on the screen, Ian.
Is it not? Okay, let's have another go. Share screen. Let's try again. Oh yes, share, there we go.
There we go.
Okay.
So, and then you've got to press this slideshow.
Yeah, and do you have to do something, Gordon?
No, you do it from the, see, on the left-hand side, from the beginning, you press that button.
From the beginning, there we go. Right.
Right, so it's all yours, Ian.
All mine. Okay. I should start by saying that this is a talk that I gave last year, or at least it's based on a talk I gave last year. And I've given it a short title, just China, for the simple reason that my full title wouldn't fit on the invitation. But I based it to begin with around the travels of Marco Polo, and then I followed that to a description of the Silk Roads, and related that to modern day China and some of the policy challenges that modern day China presents to us in the Western world. And I'll try and illustrate all of this with the slides that you see on the screen. So here we go. In 1271, the young Venetian merchant Marco Polo, his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo sailed down the Adriatic en route for Palestine, then to Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and thence through the mountains and deserts of Central Asia and China's western province of Xinjiang, before arriving at the court of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan in Kambulak, modern-day Beijing. During his 24-year absence from his homeland, he traveled on the Great Khan's business to many parts of China, as well as into Vietnam and Myanmar, before making his homeward journey across the South China Sea, through the Malacca Straits to the Indian Ocean and Sri Lanka, up the western coast of India, and finally overland via the Black Sea to Venice. Wait a minute, there you go. Right. So this gives you the blue trip is Niccolo and Maffeo's journey, which took place earlier in the century. By Marco's time, Kublai Khan, who was the grandson of Genghis Khan, had ruled over the Yuan dynasty in an area covering what is now Greater China. Moving on. Whilst the rest of Genghis's conquests were divided into three other major divisions, or khanates, covering southern Russia, Persia, and Central Asia. There they are. Ultimately establishing a Pax Mongoliana, in which it was possible to travel from the western shores of the Black Sea for 6,000 kilometers to the Yellow River within and under the protection of the Mongol Empire. As Marco writes in his prologue, the great Khan gave the brothers Niccolo and Maffeo a tablet of gold, or paisa, on which was written that the emissaries, wherever they went, should be given all the lodging they might need and horses and men to escort them from one land to another. By way of more familiar context, in England at the time, the throne was occupied by an ailing Henry III, shortly to be replaced in 1272 on his return from the Eighth Crusade by Edward I. Britain was a small island off the west coast of the Eurasian landmass, barely emerging from the Dark Ages. It was to be another 200 years before Bartholomew Dias became the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope, thereby opening a sea route to India and the Far East. And it was another 30 years beyond that before Vasco da Gama actually reached India by sea. The great empires and wealthy land and sea trade routes of Central Asia and the Far East long predated Europe's rise to prominence in the 18th century. Kublai Khan was a very different proposition from his grandfather Genghis, having absorbed many of the best elements of Chinese culture and having proved himself a much more energetic and able administrator than China had seen for centuries. Marco describes him as the wisest and the most able in all respects, the best ruler of subjects, and the man of the highest character of all that have ever been in the whole history of the Tatars. Kublai for his part, saw great potential in the Polo's visit. The long-term Mongol vision was overlordship of Europe beyond their existing empire in accordance with heaven's decree, which is a long-held Chinese aspiration which still has resonance today. Domestically, Kublai was trying to balance the competing demands of Buddhists, Nestorian Christians, and Daoists within his realm. Even his mother was a Nestorian Christian. He saw in the advent of two Catholic Latins, Niccolo and Maffeo, the possibility of balancing these demands. Kublai commissioned the Polo brothers on their return to ask the Pope for two things. First, for 100 priests educated and able to argue the truth of their religion, and some of the holy oil from the sepulchre of Christ in Jerusalem. Kublai declared that if convinced of the truth of Christianity, he would convert and all his followers with him, so that there will be more Christians in his realm than in Europe, which was quite a prize for any pope to pursue. It all went wrong, however, when Niccolo and Maffeo finally made it back to Acre to find that the Pope had died meanwhile, but that they did meet the papal ambassador Teobaldi Visconti, who quickly hoisted in the significance of the Polo's commission from Kublai. He enjoined them to patience while a new Pope was elected. The Polos returned to Venice, where Niccolo found that his wife, Marco's mother, had died during their 16-year absence. By this time, Marco was about 17, and so when the elder Polos set off on their return journey to China, they took Marco with them. On the long journey across Asia, Marco tells of Alexander the Great, of high, rich, jewel-rich mountains and their pure air and health-giving properties. The route took the party through the Wakhan corridor, so called because it follows the river of that name. It is 200 kilometers long and runs between the Hindu Kush, the Pamirs and the Karakorums, between the former Soviet republics of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan to the north and Pakistan to the south, within borders set between the Tsarist and British empires in the 19th century. Marco seems to have been the first Westerner to describe this tough and awe-inspiring place, and the last to do so until the 19th century. The Chinese called the place midway between heaven and earth, and Marco remarks that it is said to be the highest place in the world. He describes the high plain and the great lake, and noted that at that altitude, fire was less effective. He found the air so pure and residents there so healthful that the sick climbed up there to be cured, mentioning that he had himself become well again, having been sick for about a year. Just give you a different map. Yeah, that's that one. From here, the party most likely went over the Wahkia Pass at over 16,000 feet, from where he probably saw the upper reaches of the Oxus, which was the farthest extent of Alexander's conquests. The region they now entered was a land of many peoples, but absorbed by the Mongol conquests, and in Marco's description, now subject to the Great Khan. Modern China inherited the borders staked out by Genghis and Kublai, and these remain Chinese to this day. We don't know the exact date of the Polos' arrival at Xanadu or Beijing, but it is estimated to have been between 1271 and 1275. For all its inconsistencies and omissions, Marco's account of his travels owes its enduring fascination to the fact that although he may not have been the first or the only Westerner to have traveled to China, he was the only one to have left us a record of what he saw and observed. For example, here is his description of Kublai's summer palace at Xanadu. The pleasure dome imagined by Coleridge in his opium befuddled poem. Here we are. Marco writes, "The palace itself has a very high roof. The walls of the hall and chambers are all covered with gold and silver and decorated with pictures of dragons and birds and horsemen and various breeds of beasts and scenes of battle. The ceiling is similarly adorned, so that there is nothing to be seen anywhere but gold and pictures. The hall is so vast and so wide that a meal might well be served there for more than 6,000 men. The number of chambers is quite bewildering. The whole building is at once so immense and so well constructed that no man in the world, granted that he had the power to effect it, could imagine any improvement in design or execution. The roof is all ablaze with scarlet and green and blue and yellow and all the colours that are, so brilliantly varnished that it glitters like crystal, and the sparkle of it can be seen from far away. And this roof is so strong and so stoutly built as to last for many a long year." Among the other remarkable things Marco describes about Kublai's empire was the highly developed postal system, which depended on some 200,000 horses and enabled messages to be sent across the vast empire within a matter of days. He also gives a detailed description of the paper money issued and universally circulated in Kublai's China, sealed with the seal of the Great Khan, to which are added the signatures and seals of several officials. This procedure gave paper currency the same authoritativeness as if they were made of gold or silver. By comparison, no such paper currency appeared in England until the founding of the Bank of England in 1694. Marco goes on to describe many aspects of Chinese, for instance, the use of coal, which he calls black stones, to heat the many bathhouses used 3 times a week or even every day by a population which was so enormous, and there were so many bathhouses that they could not possibly all be heated by wood alone, so that there could never be enough wood to maintain such a conflagration. So these stones, being very plentiful and very cheap, effect a great saving of wood. There are equally graphic descriptions of the hunt, which lasted from December to January, whilst the Khan was in Khanbalik. He would hunt boars, stags, harts, roebucks, bears, and the like. Kublai was borne by 4 elephants carrying the very handsome shelter of wood, covered inside with cloth of beaten gold and outside with lion skins, from which the Khan enjoyed the hunt. Of the richness of the tents lined with ermine and lion skins for the Khan's use on his travels, the lions and leopards used in the chase, and the thousands of people involved in the exercise. Among the many other things of which Marco leaves a record is the existence of Japan, hitherto unknown to the West. He describes it as a place of great wealth with an abundance of gold and pearls, as well as spices. However, he admits that he never actually went there. There is not space or time here to describe all the aspect of life in Kublai's China recorded in the travel, to suffice it to say that they paint a picture of abundant wealth and plenty in every sphere, from the quantity and beauty of Kublai's concubines and the honor that choosing a nobleman's daughter for himself bestowed upon the girl's father, and the size and richness of the main palace at Khanbalik, as we already described. Such was the esteem in which the Polos appear to have been held by Kublai Khan, that when the time came that they wanted to leave and return home, the Khan declined their request. But in 1292, Kublai's great nephew, then ruler of Persia, sent representatives to China in search of a potential wife, and they asked the Polos to accompany them. So they were permitted to return to Persia with the wedding party, which left that same year from southern China on a fleet of 14 junks. The 2-year voyage was a perilous one. Of the 600 people in the convoy, only 18 survived, including all 3 Polos. The Polos left the wedding party after reaching Hormuz and then traveled overland to the port of Trebizond on the Black Sea and thence back to Venice. As we mentioned above, the remarkable thing about the travels is that they exist as the only written record of a highly developed civilization of which the Western world hitherto knew virtually nothing. But the travels were not written contemporaneously with the journey that Marco describes, but sometime after his return. It was in fact a collaboration written in 1298 to 99 between Polo and a professional writer of romances, Rustichello of Pisa. It is believed that Polo related his memoirs orally to Rustichello, while both were prisoners of the Genoese Republic, following a war between Venice and Genoa, during which Marco had been captured. It's often extremely difficult to be certain from the text the places that Marco is describing, but it is certain at least some of them he never visited, for instance, the Mongol capital of Karakorum. Be that as it may, the travels have entered and remain an essential part of the canon of Western historical writing. I'll move on to another map now, because we now move on to the section describing the Silk Roads. I can't see if this one's it. No, it isn't. Yes, here we are. Right, okay. The Silk Road is a term used to describe the network of trade routes which have linked Europe and the Far East since ancient times, long predating Marco's travels. The term itself, in fact, was not coined until 1877, when the eminent German geologist and traveler Ferdinand von Richthofen, an uncle of the First World War air ace of Red Baron fame, used the term Seidenstraßen to describe the complex of transcontinental routes trade. You can see from this map that the Silk Roads, both by land and sea, were accompanied by very high risks posed by climate, terrain, war, politics, extortion, bribes, taxes, robbery, uncertainties of supply, changing fashion and demand, and natural disasters. And yet the lure of rewards was such that merchants throughout the ages have undertaken these hazardous journeys in search of the sometimes fabulous returns on their investment. A successful venture could yield profits of hundreds or even thousands of % on the outlay. Marco became known in Venice as the millionaire for the fortune with which he returned from his travels. The modern historian Peter Frankopan, who has published 2 books on the subject, describes the Silk Roads as a network which fans out in every direction, routes along which pilgrims and warriors, nomads and merchants have traveled, goods and produce have been bought and sold, and ideas exchanged, adapted and refined. They have carried not only prosperity, but also death and violence, disease and disaster. With trade and interchange came the development of major cities and centers of learning right across Central Asia, such as Samarkand, Kabul, Bukhara, Kashgar, and Merv. the latter being described by one 10th century geographer as a delightful, fine, elegant, brilliant, and extensive, pleasant city, the mother of the world, all but forgotten in modern times. It was no wonder that as far back as Alexander in 331 BC, that his interest was attracted to the east with its riches and learning, rather than to the west, which had nothing at all to offer. Much the same remained the case by Marco's time a millennium later. Alexander did not stop at merely conquering vast territory. He also established a string of cities. Herat, Kandahar, Bagram were all established by him as staging posts across the spine of Central Asia. Greek influence, especially language, flowed eastwards along these routes to India. Alexander's death was followed by the Seleucid dynasty, founded by one of his generals, who found himself ruling an empire stretching from the Tigris to the Indus. At the same time, the Chinese Han dynasty was expanding its influence westwards, securing its core territories and establishing control of what is now the Xinjiang province of Western China. But expansion westward brought with it not only trade, but also endemic conflict with the tribesmen of the steppes. The trade involved principally horses, for which the Han Empire had an insatiable demand for its armies, and for the Xiongnu tribesmen who valued, guess what, Chinese silk very highly. Hence the origins of the silk trade and the routes that the Han defeat of the Xiongnu in 1119 BC opened up to the west thereafter. Some parts of northern China had in fact been exporting silk westwards, even as far as the Crimea and Central Europe, for at least 500 years before this. But it was the Han Emperor Wu who now instituted a state-backed trade in silk cloths and yarns, which, as well as providing unprecedented wealth for the emperor's treasury, also enabled China to exercise diplomatic advantage through the control of supply. The incorporation of Egypt into the Roman Empire after the death of Cleopatra in 30 BC and the long period of peace which followed it led to a huge increase in the wealth of Rome, thereby creating a market for luxury goods of all kinds, silks, spices, tin, copper, lead, gemstones, and ivory, arriving from the east. There was an immense increase in trade, both via the overland route through Parthia to China and via developing sea routes to India via the Red Sea. Let's see that one, there we are. You can see that this dotted line down here going into the Red Sea and across to the western coast of India. Of the imports from the east, over 90% of Rome's imports from China. In the opposite direction, there grew up a great demand for Roman coinage, much of it used unaltered in India, or otherwise melted and recast in local currency. A lively trade developed across what we nowadays call the Indian Ocean, between the Gulf and the west coast of India, with as many as 120 ships laden with trade goods and bullion leaving the Red Sea ports for southern India each year, departing between March and September and returning in November when the winds prevailed in the opposite direction. The increase in popularity of Chinese silk amongst the moneyed classes of Rome led to much disapproval amongst the Mary Whitehouses of the day, with Seneca, amongst others, horrified by the popularity of the thin flowing material that hid neither the curves nor the decency of the Roman ladies, undermining the very foundations of marital relations. Silk was for him simply a cipher for exoticism and eroticism. 100 years later, Pliny the Elder was complaining not about the indecency, but the cost to the Roman economy of so much wealth flowing eastward to pay for it all. It was to the east that the Emperor Constantine shifted the center of gravity with the establishment of Constantinople on the site of the ancient city of Byzantium in about 330 AD. In a strategic position commanding the entrance to the Black Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and the trading routes to Central Asia and the East. Let's then fast forward to the early 7th century, when the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad leader of a small religious movement in Arabia, quickly developed into a civilization which came to dominate not only Persia, but everywhere from Syria to Morocco, and ultimately as far up the Pyrenees in the west and the Ferghana Valley on the northwestern borders of China. Within a century of its birth, Islam dominated territory more extensive than anything the world had seen since the time of Alexander the Great, and with it, all the trade routes it encompassed. In 750, the Abbasid dynasty established its dominance over the Umayyad predecessors and moved the center of its empire from Damascus to Baghdad. The city became the marketplace of the world, with luxury goods arriving both by sea and land routes of ancient times. Maritime trade via India facilitated the transport of bulk goods that were uneconomic and impractical to transport by overland caravan, as it had in Roman times. It was a further 800 years before Europeans found their way into the Indian Ocean and thence to the Far East by sea. Meanwhile, Western Europe remained largely irrelevant to this bustling trade. From the earliest times, the Silk Roads transmitted ideas and wealth, civilization and religious exchanges, and helped fashion the rise of empires. In the 14th century, however, they also brought the Black Death from China to Europe, something which perhaps has a familiar contemporary ring to it. How does all this relate to the present day? Well, you will all no doubt be familiar, in outline at least, with the modern Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. This was launched in September 2013 in a speech given by Chinese President Xi Jinping in the gleaming new capital of Kazakhstan at Astana. He said, "It is a foreign policy priority for China to have good relations with its neighbors. Inspiration should be taken from the network of connections that bound people together in the past. Throughout the millennia, the people of various countries along the ancient Silk Road have jointly written a chapter of friendship that has been passed on to this very day." Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, had said something similar 2 years previously, when she said that historically the nations of Central Asia and Southern Asia were connected and the rest of the continent by a sprawling network called the Silk Road. "Let's work together to create a new Silk Road," she said. Unlike Clinton's rhetoric, however, Xi's speech in Astana was followed up with concrete proposals and the commitment of hard cash. The US, by contrast, only ever pledged a paltry $113 million of investment. The Chinese initiative initially became known as the One Belt, One Road Initiative, the belt referring to the overland routes to China's neighbors and beyond, and the road to the maritime route, a sea route linking China to the Indian Ocean, the Gulf, and the Red Sea. Have a look at this map, and it's immediately apparent how close the practical parallels are to the historic trading routes, both overland and by sea, even if only for the obvious reason that there are actually few alternative routes by either means that make any sense. In the minutes of the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party for November 2013, it's recorded that, quotes, "We will set up development-oriented financial institutions, accelerate the construction of infrastructure connecting China with neighboring countries and regions, and work hard to build a Silk Road economic belt and a maritime Silk Road to form a pattern of all-round opportunities." They were as good as their word. By the middle of 2015, $890 billion had been committed by the China Development Bank to spend on some 900 projects, mainly focusing on transport, infrastructure, and energy. Plans for a further 1,000 projects in 49 countries were announced 6 months later by the Chinese Import-Export Bank. There are no specific geographical criteria for this initiative, the maritime element of which is designed specifically to extend its reach to Africa and beyond. Some 80 countries are now part of the Belt and Road Initiative, as it is now called. These include, as well as Central Asia, countries in South and Southeast Asia, as well as the Middle East, Turkey and Eastern Europe, Africa and the Caribbean. China's ambition went further than this, as set out in a major forum in Beijing in May 2017. Xi Jinping declared that the initiative could change the world. Exchange will replace estrangement, he said. Mutual learning will replace clashes, and coexistence will replace a sense of superiority. The Belt and Road Initiative would add splendor to human civilization and build a new era of harmony and trade. Xi Jinping was keen to emphasize that in the modern world, China not only could, but should be part of the global community of nations, providing leadership that emphasized the benefits of mutual cooperation. Much of this and the focus on infrastructural development was based on China's own experience. Its own economic miracle from the 1980s onwards taught important lessons about how policy, infrastructure, investment and poverty alleviation go hand in hand. The initiative was explicitly designed to fix the underdevelopment of infrastructure in recipient countries, ran the official line. Though it is inevitably hard to obtain precise figures from China, nevertheless, some major projects have got underway. These include the China-Pakistan corridor, including major investment into roads, energy generation, and the construction of a deep water port at Gwadar in southern Pakistan, which is there, if you can see my arrow. The total value of these projects is estimated at around $60 billion. There are also plans for a high-speed rail link between Karachi and Peshawar, halving the journey time of over 1,000 miles. In parallel, projects and multi-billion-dollar loans have been approved for motorways, power plants, and deep water ports in Southeastern Asian countries from Bangladesh, Myanmar, Cambodia, Vietnam, and the Philippines to Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and Thailand. The rationale behind the Belt and Road Initiative is threefold. The first focuses on China's long-term demand for resources, especially energy, where the country's demand is expected to treble by 2030. Efforts have focused on building new oil and gas pipelines from the huge underexploited resources of Central Asia, as well as on new agreements with the Middle Eastern suppliers for long-term bulk supply. In 2017, China became the world's largest importer of oil, averaging 8 million barrels per day, which is equivalent to almost the entire daily production of Saudi Arabia. As well as energy to feed the basic requirements of the giant economic machine, there is also the quest for materials that will fuel the industries of the future. An example is cobalt, which is an essential ingredient in the manufacture of batteries, which will be fundamental to China's ambition to lead technology in the electric automotive industry. The principal repository of this and other essential minerals is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which holds some 54% of world resources. The Chinese ambition is to control the market in cobalt. As one commentator, Bruno Mackay, has put it in his book, Belt and Road, who rules cobalt commands the battery market. Who rules the battery market commands the electric car market. Who rules the electric car market commands the world. In this way, China aims to coordinate its industrial policy with those of countries of interest to it in providing supply chains. In return, China can offer cheap financing and its experience of an economic model that has proven very successful in boosting rapid urbanization and industrialization. Hand in hand with this have gone new preoccupations with air and water quality and efforts to look outside the country for new sources of foodstuff to feed an increasingly urbanized population. The second impetus for the initiative is to move China beyond the production of basic materials such as steel and cement and into higher value and higher tech products. This involves offshoring basic production to other parts of Asia, particularly the near neighborhood of Central Asia, which are in turn are keen for new infrastructure, where Chinese funding and know-how can fill useful gaps. Investment needs in these regions are estimated by the Asia Development Bank at around $22.6 trillion by 2030. In the longer run, China also stands to benefit from meeting the ballooning demand for consumer goods that can be expected to develop from its current low base throughout Southeast Asia. Development of infrastructure can only help bring forward the day when consumer demand in this region starts to rise. But nowadays, Chinese ambitions go beyond this, as witness the fact that whereas 20 years ago, Germany could export its specialized machine tools to China in the confidence that the latter could offer no competition, nowadays the two countries are engaged in joint design of such products, and China has even become a direct competitor. Ultimately, Chinese ambition extends to controlling global product standards, with the potential for billions of dollars of earnings in royalties in, for example, the electronics sector. There is no way of entering global markets without adopting global standards, so it is very much in China's interests to exert pressures on countries participating in the Belt and Road Initiative to adopt Chinese standards on everything from construction to finance and data to data management and electronics, with obvious implications for post-Brexit Britain, given our declared intention to depart from EU standards. China's third preoccupation is, of course, security. China is bordered in the west by Afghanistan, which has been in chaos since 2001 and is inherently unstable. Afghanistan borders on the Xinjiang province, which is the repository of China's principal coal, oil, and gas resources. It is also home to the Muslim Uyghur people, whom Beijing fears are vulnerable to separatism and radicalization. Thousands of Uyghurs went to fight in Syria, and they are a clear security threat. Hence the arrests, imprisonments, and re-education camps, the existence of which Beijing denies. There has been increased security cooperation with Tajikistan and Pakistan, as well as Chinese efforts to mediate in Afghanistan itself. Security, as well as expansionist considerations, have played a part in Chinese activity in the South China Sea. Since 2013, China has been creating a series of man-made islands in the region and developing their military potential, notwithstanding the ruling that in so doing, China had breached the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in 2014, which of course China ignored. Seen from Beijing's point of view, the fortification of the islands is part of a defensive measure designed to protect China's position rather than as an expansionist initiative. Others in the neighborhood understandably see things otherwise, as does the US, which has long been the guarantor of freedom of navigation, both here and more generally. However, according to some commentators, up to half of the world's tonnage passes through the South China Sea, making it the crossroads of global economy. China aims to ensure that it can get what it needs securely, safely, and without interruption, and is acutely aware of the vulnerability stemming from its dependence on global shipping and the pinch points around access to the sea. And you can see that everything that goes to and from southern China has to go through the South China Sea and then through the Malacca Straits before it can get anywhere. Otherwise, it has to go all the way around the Philippines, around Indonesia, adding a fortnight or more to the journey. So you can see the strategic importance of the South China Sea to China. Of course, this bit of China's coastline doesn't really go anywhere except to Korea. All this makes it look as if China has built up an unassailable advantage. Already the world's second largest economy, and with influence extending across the developing world. But there are flaws and weaknesses both in the BRI model and internally in China's situation. First, the BRI itself, many of whose projects depend on generous loans to recipient countries. But an increasing number of those countries find themselves in difficulties with debt repayments. Kenya, for example, is having to bear the cost of a new railway and intercity expressway, which threatens to increase debt from 40 to 60% of GDP. the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, as we mentioned earlier, is essential to China's plans to dominate the electric automotive industry, where a deal between the government and a Chinese mining consortium is worth more than the entire annual budget of the country. There are similar problems in Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Laos, and Mongolia, where debt levels could lead to sovereign default, leaving them at the mercy of creditors, i.e. China. Unsurprisingly, India has frequently expressed serious reservations about the BRI and did not attend the BRI forum in 2017, referred to above. Indian commentary on the BRI has stressed the importance of good governance, rule of law, openness, transparency, and equality in the development of connectivity initiatives, all fields in which China's behavior leaves a lot to be desired. India's sensitivities are especially aroused by Chinese focus on Pakistan, not least by proposals to develop transportation links in Kashmir, a territory which is still disputed between India and Pakistan. India has called this a violation of territorial integrity and a major problem for them. They could hardly put it more clearly. India has also stepped up its naval activity in the Indian Ocean in response to the increased Chinese naval presence there. Things in China itself have shown signs of brittleness and fragility, as set out in a recent book, Red Flags by George Magnus, which is subtitled, Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy. First, Xi himself. Since coming to power in 2012, he has placed a premium on the primacy and importance of the Chinese Communist Party in all walks of life. Xi has developed into a strong leader who has centralized power around himself, demanding loyalty and suppressing dissent, whilst ensuring the primacy of party control over all organs of the state. However, this leaves no provision for succession to Xi, either as party general secretary and chairman of the military commission, or as president, which he made himself for life in 2018. It also leaves him ultimately with sole responsibility when things go wrong, and China did not have a good 2020. Daily news coverage around the world of riots in Hong Kong, followed by a government cave-in to the demand that the extradition law be withdrawn, an unequivocal and emphatic rejection of China's claims on Taiwan in the re-election of Tsai Ing-wen as president, persistent security problems in Xinjiang, the trade war with the US, Xi's handling of which has drawn criticism even at home, the authorities' initially clumsy and secretive handling of the coronavirus, and a recent renewed outbreak of the virus around Beijing. Meanwhile, there is nothing about the recent history of China to sustain the notion widely entertained in the Western world that economic development in China would bring with it also political liberalism. All the signs, in fact, point in the opposite direction. On another side, much of the investment that has promoted the remarkable Chinese growth figures is sustained by debt, both at state level and regionally, where local government entities are estimated to owe the equivalent of up to a third of the entire Chinese economy, most of it to state banks, and mostly used to fund property and construction projects of dubious value. Then there is the demographic challenge in a situation where the population is aging at a much faster rate than in the West, raising the risk that China will grow old before it grows rich enough to sustain its aging population. President Xi recognized economic challenges first outlined in 2007 and spoke of the need to rebalance the economy, lower dependence on credit and investment, and build a more innovative, service-oriented and equal society, all of which would mean much slower growth rates than we have been led to believe. All of these come on top of the traditional strategic Chinese challenges to Han Chinese dominance, which have been a preoccupation throughout its 2,000-year history, the threat from the peoples of the periphery. Let's now turn to the wider strategic implications of all this. China is and has remained, with the exception of what it refers to as its century of humiliation from about 1849 to 1940, the overwhelmingly dominant influence in Eurasia. But there is now a regional rival in the form of India, equally populous, though in many ways less developed. It is nevertheless has much to offer by way of example to other developing nations that China does not. First, it offers a model of a functioning democracy, an independent judiciary after the Western model, and a more or less free press, ideas that are all anathema to the hegemonistic, control freak Chinese Communist Party. Second, India allows a flourishing cultural sector independent of the state, particularly in the film industry, altogether unlike that in China. Such considerations mean that India has a soft pull power that China cannot match. We might also note that Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and Malaysia all achieved economic prosperity a generation earlier than China, whilst maintaining or developing free democratic governance in a way that China has quite failed to do. So there are plenty of alternative regional models available to those nations still developing. India has moreover kept a cautious distance from the Belt and Road Initiative. We have already noted India's anxieties about the BRI's focus on Pakistan and Kashmir, and it is easy to forget that the two countries, both nuclear armed and with a long history of tetchy relations, almost came to war in 2017 and continue to endure tense relations along their common border. There is also rivalry in the Indian Ocean, with a notable increase in Chinese naval activity and its interest, for instance, in the Maldives. India cannot but be concerned at the Chinese investment in the Pakistani port of Gwadar, exclusively for civilian use just now, but with the obvious potential for military development too. The extent to which its own regional activities are having repercussions within China can be gauged by its response to joint naval exercises in 2018 between 23 states, including India, Australia, Malaysia, Myanmar, New Zealand, Oman, and Cambodia. The Chinese Global Times spoke of inflamed regional tensions and warned of the potential for expanding conflict from land to sea. A great deal has happened since this paper was originally written. COVID has dominated world attention, with the finger still pointing at China as having originated it. Policymakers have become much more aware of the strategic threat posed by China, both militarily in the region and economically worldwide. The UK followed the US in rescinding its decision to buy Chinese Huawei technology for its G5 networks. UK companies are increasingly under pressure to shun Chinese cotton, where there are links with worker exploitation in Xinjiang province. And Australia is coming together with other Southeast Asian countries to form a naval and defense consortiums in response to the perceived Chinese threat. The West as a whole, however, remains divided in its response to the challenge, with the EU, for instance, having just entered a long negotiated agreement with China, which for the first time permits European investment in and access to extensive areas of Chinese economy, including cloud services, financial services, private health care, and services related to air and maritime transport. The West's position is further compromised by dependence on China for meaningful progress in combating climate change. As former diplomat and China commentator Charles Parton put it, we have no strategy for dealing with China, but China certainly has one for dealing with us. Let me conclude with two paradoxes for your consideration. The first concerns the scenes on Capitol Hill in Washington on the 6th of January. What a propaganda gift is offered to dictators and anti-democratic forces everywhere, especially to Presidents Putin and Xi. Their propaganda machines will be vindicated in their representation of democracy as dangerous for order and stability, as well as undermining American claims to leadership of the free world, and offering their own management of affairs as a more preferable model, something they are keen to promote around the world. On the other hand, the scenes on Capitol Hill are likely to have provoked are likely to have provoked profound unease in both Beijing and Moscow. It has been Beijing's central preoccupation throughout China's 2,000-year history how to maintain order in an empire of well over 1 billion people. Today, they are confronted with serious challenges in both Xinjiang and in Hong Kong. And while it seems that a repeat of Tiananmen Square is not yet an option for Beijing, we cannot rule it out in all circumstances. How do we respond if something like that happens in Hong Kong? Meanwhile, in Moscow, if there is anything that keeps Putin awake at night, it is the fear that the color revolutions that liberated much of the Soviet Empire in the 1990s could overwhelm him too. Look at what has been happening in next door Belarus. And it remains to be seen how this weekend's demonstrations in Moscow and elsewhere in support of Alexei Navalny will turn out. The good news for democracy is that notwithstanding ongoing tensions in American society, and there are many, the system proved resilient. Even conservative judges threw out every legal challenge to the election result for lack of evidence. And even ultra-loyalist Vice President Mike Pence, no doubt with an eye to the 2024 election, ultimately declared his loyalty to the law and the Constitution above that to the president. Stability was restored without recourse to police brutality and arbitrary arrest. The other puzzle is how the West should respond to the strategic challenge from China, to which our political leaders have belatedly woken up. We are in a fix. On the one hand, you have only to look at the port of Felixstowe and consider where all those containers are coming from and to where the empty ones are returning, to realize how closely tied in we are to Chinese economic machine. The industries of tomorrow, on which Brexiteer hopefuls pin so much hope, are those in which China has already built up a significant advantage: electronics, AI, electric vehicle technology, and so on. It is an explicit aim of Chinese policy to bring as much of the world as possible to adopting Chinese production and trading standards in replacement of those that currently obtain. That is before you consider the military threat that China presents in the region and the bullying tactics they have adopted towards some of our closest allies in the region, Japan and Australia, for instance, not to mention the low-level war currently in progress between India and China on their common border. Taiwan, too, is a litmus test of Western resolve to defend its values and allies in the region. And yet the West is seriously divided. On the one hand, the EU has stolen a march with its recent conclusion of the trade and investment agreement, to which post-Brexit Britain is not a party, thereby losing out on the opportunity to profit from an opening up of a market of 1.3 billion people to areas where we excel. And the Biden team have already expressed their dismay at this development. On the other hand, for Britain, much depends on the success of the Glasgow Climate Change Conference in November, a centerpiece of British foreign policy, both because of its own importance and in pursuit of global Britain. But without China's full commitment, it will achieve little. Yet Britain, with good reason, is in the front line in its criticism of Chinese policy in both Hong Kong and Xinjiang. But then again, there are all those consumer goods that we buy every day. I leave you with these thoughts.
Thanks very much, Ian.